So today's program seizes this particular opportunity to look at the gap in the exhibition through a collection that spans from 1860 to the 1960s. Unseen Burma, Early Photography 1862 to 1962 is a recently published book by Thweep Rittinaphakorn, or more fondly known as Aik. His book is a captivating visual primer of Burma, spanning a century before the 1962 Burmese coup d'etat. The photographs came into Aik's collection through his research in textile history. Divided into 3 chapters, Changing Times, Changing Face, Multifaceted Burma, and the Grand Tour, the richest of Burma's history is found through the thoroughness of the photo captions. Aik's book not only looks at court photographs of the last Burmese monarch in the country, but also reveals glimpses to lesser-known cities other than Mandalay and also Rangoon. Aik's presentation will be followed by a short response by Peter Lee, as well as the discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Singh Eugene. Peter Lee, who is amongst us here today, is a writer, presenter, curator, and researcher, a multi-hyphenate known for his deep interest in the hybrid cosmopolitan history in Southeast Asia through Peranakan culture, textile, and also photography. His presentation will reflect on areas in Aik's books that resonate with his own research and collection interests. Peter is also key to this exhibition for his generosity as a lender to some of the more significant works that make up the 19th and also 20th century period in the second section of our exhibition, Portraits and Performance. In case you are not aware, the exquisite pair of ambrotypes featuring Hamenku Buno Wono VI, as well as his principal consort, the Ratu Kencana, in the second section is from his collection. Today's discussion will no doubt look at pictures that span a complex timeline and also history of Burma, Myanmar, across a history of annexation, colonization, of independence, protests, and also coups. It will also be an overlap of discipline and interests, but such is also the versatile story of photography. So without further ado, may I invite Aik for his presentation. Please join me in welcoming him and this esteemed panel today.
Thank you so much for the National Gallery in Singapore for seeing the value of my work, for inviting me to be here and treat me so well in everything. And I'm very excited to share with you about my book today. But thank you, Z, as well, for the very thorough introduction. My collection actually started off not with photographs, but I collect them because I study textiles. I want to see how people dressed in the old days. And I think the best way for me is to look at photographs because that's the record of how people lived back then, how the textile were used, and how objects around their life were used. But then when I got into photograph, it doesn't stop to only the textiles, and it span into so many different things about textiles. And then here come this book that you see. So I'm going to share with you a little bit some of the highlights from the book, some of the worthwhile photographs that you should note in the books, and so also some of the fascinating stories that comes. I was born in 1977. So growing up during the 80s, I did not know much about Burma or Myanmar, although I live in Bangkok, which is so close to Myanmar, just less than an hour flight to Yangon. But when I was growing up, Myanmar was just, in my memory, it was a very poor country, politically unstable all the time. You hear about the fighting, the news, something remotely about the lady called Aung San Suu Kyi being house arrest captive in her home. This is something that I heard, and I didn't know anything much until I grew up. And then when I get into the studying of the textiles and into these photographs, I learned that there's so much about Burma that we don't know. There's something that has been missing throughout the gap of the isolation from 1960 onwards up until 2012 that it's reopened again. And only that brief period of a decade that now it shuts off again. So to me, Burma or Myanmar is almost like a time capsule that if you visited Burma today, you still see so many things that make you so nostalgic. And that's why, if you look at the title of my book, the period that I cover is from 1862 to 1962. So it starts from where part of Burma was still ruled by the native king, up until it's being fully colonized by the British, and all the way to the brief independence period. And at that time, you see from some of the photographs that everything was so hopeful. So thank you to my editor as well and River Books for agreeing on the principle when we do this kind of book, that we hope that this book will remind all the Burmese people or Myanmar people that there's still hope, although there are so many hardships that they have to face, some instability. It's a good reminder of them that how big they used to be. So when I look at the photographs of Myanmar, the collection that I compiled in this book, I see the progressions of the period over 100 years. Especially today when Z took me to the exhibition Living Pictures, we almost see the same kind of progressions from the early day when photography was used by the people from the West as a tool for different things, to record something from the exotic land, to brought back to the West, to open the new globalization, to allow people from the faraway land to see what encapsulate in these exotic Southeast Asian countries. And then it progresses to when technology was more accessible to the local. So you see some of the photographs that was taken by amateur photographers. When the world opened up after the Suez Canal was dug and traveling was much more easier, you start to get travelers coming in. So it's not only now that we travel so extensively. Back then, even though it took a month to get on the ship from Europe to come to Southeast Asia, people make it a point, to travel. And that's why my last chapter was called a Grand Tour. And then you progress to 1950s, 1960s, when the local also was already a patrons of photography. They practice the crafts themselves. They enjoy it. They use it as a memento that they give to people they love. So I think to see this progression for me is very exhilarating. And I see the same thing that Living Picture as an exhibition also give you this idea of what is happening, commonly in Southeast Asia. So I'll start first with some of the selected photographs that I had from the book. I have to see that a lot of these, some are very of historical significance, but some of them are just my favorite, so I hope you like it too. Like the first two that is shown now is from the last ruling monarch of Burma. The interesting thing is that up till now, we don't really know who took this photograph, because when Mandalay was captured in 1885, they found some glass negative being left in the palace, but we don't know who were the photographs. There's been some studies and then attributed to maybe some French photographer, but somehow there's still no proof. We know that there's so many French who took some position in the court at that time. There were also a big Armenian people or Italian people who were involved in the court. But again, I found these photos, but it was so amazing how that photography has also entered into the court, that somehow under the dynastic time, the court life and everything was almost forbidden. And one of the key thing that is also prevailing in Southeast Asia is the belief that you should not kind of replicate or do something to produce your portraitures in any form because of the fear of black magic. That's why this is the portrait of the last king, but if you go back to his father's reign, King Mindong, there's no picture of King Mindong. Also, he received many diplomatic missions into his court. He was also given a set of photographic equipment, but that was left in the court without nobody touching. So it still remains a mystery if we actually know what King Mindong actually looks like. But we know that this is the last ruling couples. And somehow, when the British took over, these films were developed and was commercialized readily. It was made into postcard, it was made into part of the archive of the photographic studios for people to order to have a glimpse of what the ruling couples of Burma looks like. I also uncovered something else interesting, like all these photographs of the lady courtiers, lady royalties from Mandalay Court. Because during the dynastic time, everything was so strictly governed by sumptuary law. You're not allowed to go into the inner court. So to have the access to see how the ladies of the court back then looked like is very, very rare. And if you have seen some photographic material of something that's taken by a professional photographer, it's the Burmese lady with the parasol posed very nicely. Those are something set up for the clients. But it's not something like this where you see the real royal lady and you see right away that their posture, their demeanor are totally different. They look elegant yet very submissive. And they have almost a very stern gaze that they don't smile. And these photographs are very rare because I've only come across them in the local publication. Not so much of it that is known outside Burma up to now. And also something like this. This is the portrait of Kinwun Minji. He is by far the most famous and the most able minister during the last years of Burmese independence before the British conquered them. And he took quite a few trips to Europe for diplomatic missions. And this is the one that was taken in Naples in Italy. And you can see that on the back, he even signed the photographs. So before completely surrender to the British, the Burmese also made an attempt to try to rectify whatever happened. He went to Europe quite a few times to try to announce that Burma was a fully sovereign kingdom, to make sure that people in the Western Hemisphere know Burma. But in the end, I think there was so many complexity that's underlying the situation that in the end, the English conquered them. But Kinwun Minji was quite well-known minister. You found a lot of written records that talks about him because he was quite instrumental during the last negotiation before the British took over in 1885. And there was also other ministers like this one. His real name is Mang Chue O, but he goes by the Burmese title, the Burmese official title like Pancha Bun. He was part of the prodigies that were sent to the West during King Mindong time to get Western education. So seeing him fully dressed is a very traditional court costume like this. But little that we know that he graduated with civil engineering degree from France. And he was very fluent in English, in French, as well as Burmese, of course, the local language. But all the foreigners who visited Mandalay at that time would praise him so much that this is such a fine example of a young new generation of Burmese gentlemen. And they would say that if Burma have 10 of people like him, they will be much, developed. But all of these were pretty much gone in the history that nobody talks about much apart from some scholar, local scholar. So to me, it's a good opportunity to bring it out to the light so that people would know that Burma used to have a very distinguished personage like this. And this is something that, I've been asked a lot, out of the curiosity. If you remember the very first picture that I showed, the ruling couple sitting on the throne, they're dressed in some costume like this. It's actually a court costume for the king, the queens, and the prince and princesses. They look very structural. And I often ask, how do they move about? How do they sit? I said, I don't know. Because these costumes are very elaborate. And there are so many components, detachable, of course, but they're made out of the leather that is stiffened with the lacquer and then covered with velvet with a lot of heavy embroidery. And you can imagine in a tropical country and to wear like this in the ceremonies, how mobile can you be? And at one time, some delegates from Burma, that they went to India for the Durbar coronation, They also wore something like this, and the tent, I'm sure some of you who are keen on colonial photograph must have seen before. And there was so much problem because wherever they go, they cannot sit. Even the British officer that took them there, they said, what am I going to do? They cannot go to garden party because with their wings and tails, they cannot sit, and I don't know where to place them. But of course, it just showed the regality of the court splendor back at that time. But now we don't see the remaining of such costumes so much. There's quite a few examples that is kept at the V&A collection. But with heavy embroidery like this, I went to V&A once asking to see the real item. The curator said, I can bring it out to you, but please, I won't take it out from the box because every time we taken it out, all the sequins falls apart and I have to gather them together. So there's only a few left nowadays. So we've seen them now in the photographic evidence, which is fascinating. But later on, when there's no court, the costume like this was still used, but mostly by wealthy people or somehow being used as a ceremonial costume. Like the photograph in the left that you see, that I believe is the original costume from the court. But after Mandalay Fall in 1885, a lot of court repositories were looted. Some of them was taken out and some of the costume was sold to collectors during colonial time, or some went to even the photographic studios and was used as a costume for their clients to come to rent, to put it on. So the photo on the left is often labeled as a Burmese princess, but I'm not sure if she's a real princess. I have no idea. But it was taken in a photographic studio. She could be a model hired by Felice Beato, putting on the dress and then pose. But I just put it to compare with the right photo. That was from 1930s. The costume was still produced and used by Burmese people, but on a special occasion. And in this case, for the ladies, for the young teens, where they go through the ear piercing ceremonies, they would have to dress up as a princess, and that is when the costume is used. But after the British came over and they exiled the Burmese monarchy and the queens to Ratnagiri in India, the top social strata of the society in Burma leave it all to the Chan prince and princesses because they were still allowed to retain their own territory, the ruling power. Because I think Burma was so vast that somehow the British took time as well in order to gauge of how to do the full control. So Chan state was actually administered by the policy of divided and rule. It's similar things that the British do to a lot of Maharajas in India, that they allow the Maharaja and the local ruling chief to still have control of their lands. But in the end, they are obliged to provide certain amount of tax every year. They're promised that they have to pledge their allegiance to the Queen Victoria, to the British kings later on. It's the same thing. So we found quite a number of the records of all these Chan elites that they still live in their own splendor throughout the Burmese colonial period. And these Chan elites also, they travel to the west, like the one on the left. This is the ruling prince from the town of Yonghue. Yonghue is actually the terminus where now if you go to Inle Lake, you have to stop at Yonghue. And then you take the boat to go into the lake. But Yonghue used to be the biggest town in the southern Chan states, and the ruling prince is very powerful. So this was taken in 1920s, and he was able to meet Duke of Windsor, who used to be like Edward VIII when he visited Burma in 1922. And on the right, that's the ruling couple from the Thibaw. Thibaw town was also, I think now you might be familiar with the town from the movie Twilights of Burma. So Twilights of Burma was the story of the Western lady who became the queen of Thibaw. So this is the ruling couple, I think 2 reigns before the lady in the Twilights over Burma. So they have a very elegant and really luxurious life because they were rich, they have access to everything. So it's also part of the cosmopolitan vibe that has spread it out throughout Southeast Asia. And this is something that I like, Without the caption down below, you wouldn't be able to guess where it was taken, I talked to a friend and she said, oh, it was just like a garden party from Downton Abbey. But if you look at the labeling at the corner, it says Memyok 1901. Memyok was a town, it's a hill station, because in central Myanmar, it's very hot. And during summertime, the British would try to find somewhere with high altitude, with cool weather. It's like what they did in India, where they go up to Simla. That's one, the hill station in India. But in Myanmar, they choose Memyok as a town. It's a few hours drive from Mandalay. And now there's still a lot of colonial buildings and everything. And they set up the community. They have the barrack, the military, the battalions and everything. So it's an English town up there. And they'll try so much to try to mimic everything that they have at home. They would order everything from England, is try to make everything as close to where they're from. But if you look closely, you see some of the dogs here. I doubt it if these are stray dog locals from Memyok. Because they brought in all the breeds of dogs, all the luxuries, the fineries that they it's just amazing to see all these pictures. Or even this one, I think the community of the expatriates in Burma was very well established because it was a long period, decades of colonizations. So they came in, they settled down, and I think one of the things is they have their children dress up in the local costumes. And I just posted one photo on Instagram a few days ago, talking about when I found the portraits of children taken in Myanmar. I don't know how long this boy lived in Myanmar, but certainly there are lots of people who were born from Caucasian parents but has lived in Myanmar until they grow up before they were forced back for whatever reason to go back to their home. And throughout their life, sometimes they never felt England was their home. It's almost like when you read the book Secret Garden, the classic novel by the English author, they talk about Mary Lennox, who were born in India and somehow was forced back to live in England. And she misses so much the heat, the tropical heats and everything. And then she hated the moor. It's so gloomy when she first arrived in England. It's something so interesting when you see different facets, even among the expatriates' life in Burma. And also with this one, with the colonialism kicked in, I think the technology, the trade, the commercial, as well as the entertainment, all come from Europe, from the Western Hemisphere, and pour into Asia. This is something, I think this portrait was taken in 1930s. It's a time when they have like the silent films. So modes of entertainment in Rangoon, the big theaters. There are so many silent films, some opera, some performing troupes that visiting Burma just to do the performance and show. And this is the actress that was very famous at that time. Her name is Kim Kin-ye. But you see that the way that she dressed, the way that she do the makeup, it's almost like you see someone stepping out from the Western silent movie. It's almost Marlene Dietrich, that kind of era, with a very white face. And also it has to be so prominent because when you act for the silent movie, the camera back then was not so good. If you paint your face so lightly, nobody will see you through the camera's lens. So the makeup would have to be very heavy. And the idea of painting the lips so small, like a rosebud, is also something like aesthetically that's introduced from the Western influence. So I think for me, I learned so much by looking at all these pictures. So when you see my book, there's always a long caption accompanying every photograph. So I hope you don't get bored of reading them yet, because this is what I see and what I read from all the photographs. And the other thing that I like so much about is the wedding picture. These are something that, from the beginning, as I said, you see the photography as a progression. In the early day, it was all practiced by the professionals. support really by the wealthy expatriate clients. But as the turn of the century, progresses in 1920, 1930, you started to get a local patrons who actually are clients of all these photographic studios. Weddings is a big occasion where everything was, also very nicely set. And these three photographs that you see something from a very traditional Burmese weddings to something that is also mixed with some cosmopolitan, the mix of culture. Like the photo in the middle, that is also taken in Mae Myok as well. You see the bride, she dressed in the Burmese long ji, but she has a Western long veil, like something from the Edwardian period. And on the right photograph, that is a good, interesting picture because the man, you can see from his face, that is very Asian. Whereas the lady, the bride, she's very Chinese. So I think in 1930s, 1940s, the idea of cross marriage between different community was more acceptable. Whereas if before 1900 or early 1900, children that were born from mixed race parents were somehow not so very well accepted, And many times that Westerner took local concubines and they have the kind of illegitimate child, it's not a pleasant life that these childs would have to bear. But unfortunately, after 1962, when the coup took over, a lot of foreign community or Anglo-Burmese community or Indian-Burmese community, they were forced to leave the country. So that's why you don't find a lot of them now. But quite often, like I went to Calcutta, I would come across someone who said, oh, my ancestor used to have business in Rangoon, but we were driven out during late 60s when the coup took over. Or this one, this is something of my favorite as well. It was one of the wedding. This is the kind of afternoon tea wedding reception, which is now pretty much uncommon. Now we only have evening reception with fancy dinner, cocktails, and after party. But back then it was quite popular to have an afternoon tea party, wedding reception. And you see so close at the foreground of a fully set table with the cake tiers, all the equipments. And it just shows how cosmopolitan, how westernized the Burmese people were. This is from 1940s. And then I still having debate with some of the people of where this was taken. It's not the Strand, maybe it was Inya Lake Hotel, I don't know where they are. But I just like the photo, it just shows you the progression of how colonialism, cosmopolitanism kicks in and then seep in through from the beginning in the elite circle and all the way down to the locals. And Burma was also rich with so much resources. They have the big ruby mines in Mogul area. If you remember from Crazy Rich Asian, the lady Astrid, she spent so much on the Burmese pigeon blood earring. It was from this mine in Mogul. So Burma used to export a lot of gemstones, rubies, sapphires, and I think the trade still continues today. And before the mine was monopolized by the court, but later on, I think the British took over and monopolized them afterward, and they introduced more modern equipment to mine the stones. And also like the petroleum production. If you go into the central region of Myanmar, which is dry zone, there's a big town that has a lot of oil fields like this, that not many people nowadays know that Myanmar used to export a lot of oil to India. And speaking of tourism, this is something that I think to me, when I see this photograph, it's almost like nowadays when you see solo tourists, small group tourists with one car, one driver, one guide traveling around in Myanmar. On the left, this is in Bagan, the Taraba gate going into the old town. The gate still stands. It looks like this, except that the road is now paved. And on the right, that is in the Chaikpun Pagoda with the 4 cardinal Buddha images facing. I think this is interesting because now it was so developed now. Everything has been renovated. They have made all the enclosures, building, but you still see the 4 Buddha colossal size facing 4 directions. So I think Burma was part of the grand tour of people traveling back in the old days. If you go into some documentation during the Gatsby time, the pre-war time, Burma was also considered part of what they call the Pearl of the Orient. I think they look at it like the string of a pearl. You start traveling from Europe, you're coming into Asia, you go to Colombo, Sri Lanka, to Bombay, Calcutta, and then Burma, Penang, Singapore, to Hong Kong, and sometimes even through Japan. So that's part of the grand tour back then. And something that I put in the book also as well is some architectural relics that is no longer there. A lot of the beautiful, elaborate monasteries like this in Mandalay were bombed during Second World War. So what remains now only in the picture. Like if you go into Mandalay, I think the oldest complete building monasteries from the dynastic time is Trenandor, which is the Golden Monasteries. But that was the royal apartment that was donated to be used as a monastery, but it wasn't built structurally as a monastery. But most of these magnificent ones were gone from the war. So what remains now for us to study is only from the pictures like this. Or something that probably familiar, but not so familiar now is Chwedagong, because Chwedagong is a living religious site that has been developed, redeveloped all the time. People with money, they want to make merit, so they donate to build new things. So this is the Chwedagong before 1900. So you see, this is a southern entrance. So if you go to Yangon now, from Scott Market, you have a road called Chwedagong Pagoda Road from Scott Market going up to Chwedagong to this southern entrance. So it's probably the most accessible for visitors back then because it comes directly from the river, from the Yangon River, all the way you can go up to this. But back then it was still a dirt track with a lot of vegetation coverings, but now it's so much developed now. And look at this is from 1894. It's almost like the pagoda is cropping up amidst all the forests and all the small huts. It's nothing like now. And something that, with the faith of the Burmese, that they are so devout into Buddhism, they donate so much money in renovating and everything that it's difficult to find something that remains in the original shape. But I can see some, I went to Yangon a few weeks ago and I walked through the Chwedagong Pagoda platform a few times. I still find some pavilion that has retained the original wood carving, but of course it's been repainted many times. But this is just show how intricate like the wood carving skills of the Burmese craftsmen that were showered to make merit, to donate to many religious sites throughout Burma. And passing in through the independence time, after Second World War, I think it was a new chapter of Burma where Burma was free, newly independent country, ready to make its presence, ready to make friends with everyone. So this is from 1950 when the first Prime Minister Unu, his wife, the First Lady, and on the far left, that's Daw Aung San Suu Kyi's mother. They were in London in 1950s. This is just taken outside Westminster Hall before they enter the Westminster for the service. It was a service for the Burma soldier who lost their life during Second World War. So I think Burma also make presence there, trying to make friends, try to make new allies, because I think after Second World War, a lot of countries gained their independence. So they have to quickly try to make friends and try to see what the position is. If you like politics, you can also look into the conference that was held called Bandung Conference in 1950s. It talks about all the kind of non-ally countries, newly independent countries that got together and tried to make their own stands of that they want to be, in the middle, neutral. Or something like this, I like this picture particularly. This is the first president of Myanmar, Sao Sui Tai. It was taken in the presidential palace. And he was wearing the black tuxedo. And the gentleman in the white tuxedo, that's Aga Khan. He was a spiritual leader of one of the Muslim sect in India. I think they probably have met in London for some meetings, but this is how they entertained back then. But not many people know about Aga Khan himself, but Aga Khan become known more because of his son who married Rita Hayworth, the film star. So then people start to wonder who Rita Hayworth married into. So it was Prince Ali Khan, who is the son of this Aga Khan. And the throne here that you see is the original lion throne from Mandalay Palace. In the old day, there was 2 lion thrones in Mandalay Palace. One is in the grand audience halls, and the other one was in the kind of council meeting hall. The one in the audience hall was burned down from the bomb during the war, the second. But the surviving one was the one in the council meeting hall. And it was once taken from Myanmar to India. I'm not sure if it's to England, but later on it was returned to Burma for a diplomatic gift after Burma gained its independence. Now it's in the National Museum in Yangon. And whatever. And not only from the political side, there's also some kind of sweet and more kind of softer side that Burma was trying to promote themselves and get into the kind of the global scene. This is this one Burmese lady. She's a film star. Her name was Win Min Tan, but she's also born like her father was Australian, but her mother was Burmese. Her full name, her real name is Helga Johnson, but she goes by the star's name as Win Min Tan, and she was cast to play with Gregory Peck in the movies called The Purple Plane. She played only one movie, but I think during the movies tour that she went all around the world, she dressed so nicely in the Burmese attire with her hair nicely made into the bun. So it's a kind of very, soft power. This is something that we spoke about so often, about soft power. And then Burma also employed that kind of strategy back then as well. And she played only one movie, but it put Burma right into the global spotlight so everyone knows. And then I think independence time for Burma was a new hope. There were a lot of people who are very well educated. The education system was very well set up. Rangoon University used to be ranked as one of the most academic, good quality in Southeast Asia. If you are scholars, you are familiar with the Journal of Burma Research Society. That also originated in Yangon, in Rangoon University. They have a lot of visiting professors from England to have a lecture to teach there. And I think the hope and everything was in the air at that time during the 60s. You can see that a lot of females will also get education and enter into different areas of careers. Not only housewife anymore, they work as a white-collar job, being a secretary, and then everything just shut off in 1962 when the coup took place. And after that, I think that's what I remember Burma from the 80s. But throughout the research here, I learned so much, and I hope that by doing this book is actually my tribute to Burma and their people, and also to remind them that whatever hardship, there's still hope. So I will leave you with, this is my last photo here. All the girls graduate from Mandalay Palace. You can see the joy, the hope fully expressed in their face. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ek. And can we welcome Peter? Yeah, and for Peter to also share about his collection of Burmese photography. Yeah, Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thought to reflect on Ek's book through my own experience with photography. So this little presentation is on how an image of Burmese monks started a photo collection. Firstly, if I may for a minute reflect on your book. I was really inspired by the way that every picture is so beautifully captured. And I think that's one of the big problems we have in sort of photo history is that we know actually so little about each image, and the amount of work you put in for each photo was just stupendous. And I learned so much from all the detailed work, and I don't know how you did it, but it was really incredible. You identified people and costumes and everything, and that was really amazing. The other thing I was very grateful about was how you put together a collection that is so different from a normal museum collection. Unfortunately, for many of us studying photography, we rely on colonial collections only. And colonial collections are formed, I think, strictly through certain methods, donations from diplomats, travelers. So they tend to have a lot of images which we can describe as having that colonial eye. And with your book, what we're seeing are pictures that run across all kinds of types of photography, from snapshots and etc. So I found that really eye-opening and very helpful for us to kind of see other forms of how we present ourselves or invent ourselves in front of the camera. So I was really grateful for these contributions. But back to my story, how a Burmese photograph triggered a photo collection. I was a student in London in the 80s and 90s, and my parents had a little apartment, a little flat just off Portobello Road. And my uncle, the late architect Lee Kip Lin, was a collector of 19th century photos of Singapore, but they were all buildings. He had lots of pictures of street scenes, but nothing of people. And I was very interested to collect Singapore photographs, but they were so expensive for a student, university student. And this is me in the 90s. And that's the flat that we lived in, which is just off Portobello Road. And so that gentleman in green is my partner Kyong. And we would go and look at all the shops, but we could never afford a picture. And in 1991, I remember it was just after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And I had come back to Singapore first, and he followed later, and he found this beautiful photograph. And you can see I framed it in Joe's frame shop on the 7th of March, 1991. And he bought it for like £10. And I thought, this is such a beautiful image, and why can't I just collect other pictures of Southeast Asia? As a student of art history, I realized that I had grown up in Singapore knowing a lot about British history and Enid Blyton, and growing up and all this sort of thing. I had visions of beautiful meadows and Famous Five and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't know anything about Asia. And I had this dream of putting together an archive of Southeast Asia from this very first photo, and that sort of triggered this idea of putting a collection together. And this was an area I could collect, which was much cheaper than photos of Singapore. But it was not the very first picture I actually acquired. In 1985 or so, I bought this photo of a straight steamship called the Hai Leong. And I did it through a postal auction. It was very difficult to buy pictures, but I managed to find it was just £20, so I could buy it then. And I showed this picture to you the other day, and it was really fascinating. My family, we had this strange obsession with pictures of steamships. My father bought me a scrapbook, and I filled it up with postcards of steamships. I never understood why. But recently, I discovered that this ship called the Hai Leong was actually owned by my great-grandfather and his brothers. They had a steamship line called Keng Yong Brothers. And this is a Straits Times account of its arrival in 1883. We never talked about all this because by 1890, the company went bust, and my great-grandfather and his siblings all went bankrupt. And this was sort of a family secret, but it was all, bankruptcy case was all out in the newspapers. But the weirdest thing was this very first image that I ever purchased of a 19th century photograph was of my great-grandfather's ship. So since then, I've formed a collection focusing on early photography in Southeast Asia. The cutoff point is, I mean, it's sort of framed within early photography only because I think expanding it beyond would have made me bankrupt by now. The collection is named after my parents, the Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kip Lee collection, so it's sort of a family collection. The bulk of the Peranakan pictures have been donated to the Peranakan Museum. Over 2,000 to 3,000 images, which actually very much resonate with your collection because it starts from the early European photographers in Asia, then to snapshots and that sort of thing. Anyway, so over the years, I've put together these pictures of early Burma, which I'd like to just share with everybody. So one of the earliest photographers in Burma was, of course, Linnaeus Tribe. And I have a small group of his pictures in this picture of what was called the Arakan Pagoda, now the Mahamuni Pagoda, which is just outside Mandalay. And that's the picture taken in 1855, a salt print, and just picture I got off the internet of how it looks like today. And I've always been interested in this German photographer in Singapore called August Sackler. And he apparently was in Burma sometime in the 1860s. It was really nice to see that in his body of works there are these really exceptional pictures of Burmese figures. Then I love these kind of rather posed pictures of one of a Burmese fisherman and a woodcutter. I would scour the photo fairs in London or antique fairs, and often you'd see the pictures of Burma were always very cheap. There was somehow very little interest, so it was a good time to pick up pictures like this. Often individual. Dealers would pull apart albums, and as you know, they often were sort of world tour albums, and dealers would often buy and split them all up because they would have clients for pictures of Japan, etc., and then the scraps, which are Burma and Southeast Asia in general, ended up in the mixed lots, and that was fun to rummage through and pick these things out. Later on in the 90s, I found a lot of wonderful pictures on eBay and before PayPal. So I used to send cash in envelopes all over the world to buy these amazing pictures. But now it's all dried up. So thanks to Ek, I've discovered I have pictures of Kampat Mingyi, who was, I'm not sure, a court official. Yeah. And the photographer was someone, as I've discovered in your book, called Clement Williams, who was taking pictures in Burma in the early 1860s, right? Yeah. And I found various versions, this gelatin silver print on the left, and a kind of a glass lantern slide on the right. And I found this on eBay as a group of lantern slides, also by Clement Williams. Some of these pictures are in your book of court officials from Mandalay. And I don't know, this could be a J. Jackson. I think nobody knows what his first name is. I see that it's only J. Jackson everywhere, and even on the internet. And a Burmese official, or Burmese, So I have to defer to Aik for the identity, and I presume he's a real official and not posing for, yeah. One of King Mindon's or King... Mindon's, okay. And of course, pictures of the last royal couple, King Thibaw and Queen Suphyalat. Interestingly, you have two pictures of this in your book. One where you can clearly see the curtain, one where you cannot see the curtain. So this is in between. You can partially see the curtain behind. And also these pictures, I think the one on the left is part of that series of the court ladies, but I only have this one. And King Mindon, as in the kind of court robes you describe. King Thibaw, sorry. And I love this picture also. You talked about the Delhi Durbar and the Shan chiefs taking part. This was in commemoration of the coronation of King Edward VII. And what I really love about this picture, though, is the gentleman standing second from left, who is wearing a Chinese lady's robe. And my Peranakan eye tries to look out for these hybrid elements in photography. Yeah. And here is a Chinese man with his Burmese family. And I love this also, the way how, as you mentioned earlier, the facial features. I think some people look Chinese, some look Burmese, some look Indian. This wonderful array of sort of, to me, port city life. And this connects also to some pictures which I found earlier. This is one taken in Yangon by a Cantonese studio. This has been donated to the Peranakan Museum. Pashu. Pashu would be the term for the Rangoon or Burmese Peranakans. They were very closely connected to Penang Peranakan families. There was a sort of network of families in Medan, Rangoon, Phuket, and Penang. And therefore, this lady would be dressed in a Peranakan style that's more associated with Penang. And some of the wealthy Penang families found brides from Yangon. So this is Mrs. Hia Sui Lee, who was born Kang Cheng Sui Nyo of Rangoon. And here on the right, she is dressed in sort of more fashionable Peranakan Nonya style, and on the left in Burmese style. Apart from that, as I said, I mentioned I picked up a lot of random pictures, and I found those of Burma, like your amazing cover. They're so enigmatic. We can just stare endlessly at these beautiful images. The one on the left, I feel you can just dream about who they are, and they look like brothers. And the one on the right, like an Anglo-Burmese boy, maybe not. But just sort of beautiful faces, beautiful expressions. And, you know, I wish I could write long captions, but I can't tell you anything more than the fact that I think they're beautiful pictures. And this one as well, this looks like a transgender. I don't know what you think, but I loved it because of that. A very handsome girl or a very pretty boy, I don't know. But it's a wonderful picture. And I looked, I think from the palm tree, it could be a cloud. But yeah, maybe you could tell me more about it. But anyway, I would connect a bit of history of the world in the cherut, tobacco coming from the Americas. I'd just like to end with this, a bit about this exhibition that was held at the Peranakan Museum in 2018, Amik Gamba, based on the donation of family photographs, based on the family collection of photographs. They're not family photographs, but which examine how photography instigated so many things in Asia. I think that really fascinates me. And I think it also allowed us to see that Asians were not sort of passive kind of subjects in the sort of dawn of photography, and how, for example, even Peranakan families had taken it on and used it for their own purposes right from the very, very start. I also think it's important to remember that it was, and they didn't take it on as a sort of, the wonderful, scary world of science. I mean, we often see that sort of idea that when photography came to Asia, the Asians were also afraid of the camera. Of course, they were, as you mentioned, there were certain superstitions, but these superstitions existed in the West as well. It was not just things that happened in the rest of the world. It was a global thing. And how photography, especially with the sort of handheld cameras, you start seeing people experimenting with who they were or not at all. And I think one important thing to realize is how being in front of a camera is always a performance, but sometimes it is not. And people didn't always feel they had to perform their identity. And this picture on the right, which is of my two granduncles, I think encapsulates this really non-performative aspect of photography. And we see so many inconsistent elements, and that's what I love about it. So one granduncle is eating with a spoon, the other with his hand. One has fashioned his cue right at the back. He's shaved his head and kept the knot just right at the back. And the other one has done it much more up the top of his head. So, and one is wearing a cotton drill cotton jacket, and the other is just in a long sleeve T-shirt. And I feel we often forget that people are just people, and we don't have to essentialize ourselves into race and identity. And people were fluid, people were inconsistent, and we always try to use photography to encapsulate a community, when often we forget that even within a family, we don't even think and agree to what we like or what we remember of the past even. So I think we see these elements in photography, that things are not so clear-cut. And we have to remember that people were as inconsistent, as random, and as we are today, and globalized already. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, and also Abe. Before we open up to questions, I'm sure everyone has many questions to ask Abe and Peter as well. And Peter, it was wonderful the way you ended, talking about the agency of the individual, and how we need not understand photography in a reductive or in an essentializing way. I think that's really important. And I think Abe really talked about the importance of photography as a form of documentation, in how we understand the complexities of changing societies in Burma and, of course, now Myanmar. So I have some questions for both of you. Really, really exciting presentations. And I was taken by the photography of the Burmese court officials and also the king and queen, got the King Thibaw. I'm just comparing it. I'm just wondering, because both of you are also very familiar with Thai photography. If you were to compare how photography was used, say for example by King Thibaw and Queen, and the Burmese officials in fashioning themselves perhaps as modern, which was what King Chulalongkorn was doing, right? Using photography as a tool to show to the Europe and America that they were also kind of modern. Were there differences or similarities that you see in how the Burmese monarchy or or the nobility use photography in representing themselves?
I think it's quite clear that for us in Thailand, I think the Thai king was much more progressive. I think with the exposure, with more curiosity of what the world is all about in the West. Whereas for the Burmese, you get, of course, the court official, the photograph was taken, and as I show you, a few of them were taken abroad. But then the king himself still in Mandalay kind of know it or not knowing it, pretend that it doesn't exist outside Mandalay. And whatever all these court officials brought back the news from the West, it's almost like something surreal that the king doesn't want to admit that it's real. I'm still sitting here in Mandalay as a center of the universe. And I'm sure that as time comes, this idea and the Burmese kings will mellow down. But unfortunately, other incidences, took over. But for Thailand, I think we are fortunate that our kings realized this sooner and jump on this bandwagon and use photography as a mean of diplomatic strategies more quicker. And I think that's how we ended up being like this, and how Burmese ended up being like that.
And I do remember that King Chulalongkorn, for example, did take photographs of himself dressed in both traditional and also Western clothes, but not in the case of King Thibaw, as far as we know. Am I?
Yes.
Both of you being, kind of, as what Z mentioned, multi-hyphenated, scholars, curators, and collectors as well. I'm just wondering if you'd like to share and unpack more with the wonderful audience that we have today, how that has shaped your collecting, almost as a kind of a practice that intersects between being a scholar, collector, and also curating exhibitions.
I'm just someone who is so curious. And I think when you see an object, as a collector, you want to know what it is made of, what do people believe in it. And especially when it comes from the past, of course, they are from people who are dead now. And how can I find out, about this? And I think that's the only guiding principle that helped me to navigate through this. And especially when Peter commented that, I wrote a lot of caption. I sit and I look at them, and I look at what they wear. I look at the dog on the photos. I look at the cake trays, and I see, I try to make sense of what happened back then. And I think that's where I find a passion. And in the end, it ended up being I don't know, you might call it nicely, but as a multidisciplinary approach. But to me, I just follow my curiosity and see where it leads me. That's all. Yes.
For myself, I started with the idea that photographs would provide a wonderful resource to look into the past. And in a way that I've ended up writing about things that rely so much on the photos I've found. And initially, it might have been born out of a sense of understanding or trying to ring fence and what is Burmese versus what is Thai. And in fact, now the more I look into all these images, I'm trying to do the reverse. What can we see that just is more of a spectrum? That my interest in Peranakan culture also started with trying to define it. And the deeper I got into it, I found it more and more difficult. And it sort of led me on to think more in terms of spectrums, and that it would be wrong nowadays to try and define anything. Actually, we need to loosen up definitions. And surprisingly, I found that the photos actually reveal all this, that even when we look at 100 years ago, what was happening 100 years ago, people were actually less consistent. People were less obsessed with identity. That it was a much more fluid expression. and it's all there. So even when I was looking at those Burmese pictures and at the clues, so if, for example, the one character who was in a Chinese lady's outfit, I thought was so adorable. Even the standard Burmese fashion comprised two kinds of jackets, one Persian-inspired and the one Manchu-inspired with the buttons. So they were wearing two styles completely, at the same time. And so even if we think of Burmese style in that time, it was already hybrid. So I found now my mission is to find the Peranakan in everything. So yeah.
That's fantastic. And it also reminds us that, we should not understand photography, in very nationalist necessarily, right? In terms of being bounded by the nation state. We should look for hybridized kind of cultural transfers that happens. I think that's so important. So I have another question about the period from 1948 to 1962. So Burma became independent in 1948, right? And I saw some images, some photographs, in X, and you were presenting, and particularly that photo of UNU, who was the prime minister. Before that, he was the foreign minister, then he became the prime minister. I found it really fascinating. You talked about the non-aligned movement in 55, when we had UNU, the Indian Prime Minister Nehru, and of course, the then President Sukarno being very much involved in the non-aligned movement. So in the period from 1948 to 1962, what differences, both of you see, in your collection of Burmese photography, the difference in terms of how photography was kind of maybe representing the officials or representing certain historical events. Were there any differences compared to maybe pre-1948, before Burma became independent? Was there a shift that you noticed?
I see a heavy use of photography for the nation building purpose. That's for sure. Because at that time, a lot of identity were recreated. But although they didn't shed all of what the British left for them, but they're trying to build their own identity. They celebrate Independence Day every year, and that was well documented. And they try to, as much as they try to promote themselves to the world, that I'm the newly born, newly independent country, but there's still a lot of internal problem about ethnicities, about the conflicts. They were trying to also deal with whatever issue inside. You get the photos, so many photos locally that you see Daw San Suu Kyi's mother traveling in different parts of Burma, wearing the dress of different ethnic peoples when she participates. You get even UNU's photo dressing in Shin's ethnic groups, joining the dance in the Shin Hills area. And those are probably the subtle use of photography, so that when it is publicized, it shows that now the nation is all bind into one as a union of Myanmar, what they call that then. So that's something that I see clearly, the new use of photography.
Peter, do you have any photographs from that period in your collection?
I do. I'm very interested also in this sort of the second half of the 20th century, because you see, say, the idea of dress and identity becomes sort of more prominent, but at the same time, it was still not as fixed as it is now, perhaps. And what was pretty amazing, we see across the board people liking to cross-dress culturally. In the 50s, I have pictures of even, I remember my mother she would wear a sari, she would wear a cheongsam, she would wear a sarong kebaya. And that was quite a fashionable thing. The other thing I think that's pretty important for us in terms of with the photographs is the fact that, especially in Singapore, we had this narrative that we were a fishing village until the Republic was formed. And when in fact, if you look at pictures from the 50s, all over, the kind of real internationalism and kind of, if I can use this word, like people were really chic and fashionable in the 50s, and it was really not a backwater, and very connected as well. And things like the movie
more
industry,
cosmopolitan than
yeah,
we think. Yeah.
very sophisticated already. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question before we open to the floor. It's really, I was taken by the rather large number of photographs of people holding on to the cheroot. And actually Peter was sharing that. And cheroot is kind of like using the dried tanat leaves, and then you mix it with the tobacco and some dried wood, and you basically smoke it. And egg. Actually, I saw one photo of that European toddler dressed. He was holding on to something. I hope it's not a cheroot.
That's a cheroot.
That's a cheroot.
Yes, but it's
I thought so.
like a prop, but not that he would smoke that, but it's more
I
of
hope
like a fashionable things that, but because you get a lot of photograph where it was taken in the studio, and cheroot, parasol was one of the popular props. And always oversized, sometimes a foot long.
Right. So even for toddlers to hold on to a cheroot, but I'm just wondering why the cheroot, and why was it so popularly used in photographs?
I think it's probably because it's so, people smoke a lot, and one of the things that I learned is that when you go to Burma and you don't find a lot of the vernacular things that remains. First, I thought it was from the harsh weather and everything, but they said no, because we have fire a lot, because back then it was all the thatch roof house, and every house they would smoke. And once they puff, and it's not a kind of modern cigarette, so every puff there'll be a sparkle, something that flicker onto the flame and catch it on the roof. So every time, I think at one time Mandalay was all burned down, the whole city. That's because of the Great Fire that sparked it off from this cheroot thing. But I think in Burma, cheroot things and betel chewing and also the tea leaf chewing thing is part of the essential in the culture.
It's a good reason not to smoke. It caused fires at that time. Just a disclaimer, I don't smoke anyway. But very, very fascinated by these cheroot, because I see it represented again and again in
I think
in
it's more
photographs.
fashionable, like at some point in the 50s, for example, or in a Gatsby, you get, all the lady dressed up in the dress with the kind of cigarette, with the pipe, and it's almost like you have a flirting kind of, gesture, something you play with the camera to communicate some message to, I don't know.
The $1 million question: have you smoked a cheroot before?
No. Unfortunately, those big cheroots were out of fashion by now, Yes. But you get a smaller version of the Burmese cigarettes.
Okay, thank you, and thanks both of you. So now we'll open to the floor, and if you have any questions, my colleagues at both ends will be passing you the microphone. So please do, speak to the microphone. Yeah, Roy.
Thank you, Ek. Thank you, Peter, for these very fascinating presentations. Just a question for Ek. In your book, Unseen Burma, there's this very strong emphasis on also setting the tone in your introduction that, internal political problems and unrest, as a result of the military takeover in 1962 and the subsequent isolation of Burma, had a role to play in terms of framing this perception of photography today, right? And there were these high hopes that came with Aung San Suu Kyi's rise to power, but ultimately they were dashed. It's kind of difficult to imagine really a time when places like Mandalay or Rangoon was a must-see on the international tourism map, in the mid-19th century all the way to the early or mid-20th century. So my question is, how relevant are these photos, in the context of contemporary visual politics in Myanmar, specifically with regards to the politics of nostalgia, and what implications do they hold today for us?
I think it started off with even before the book conceived, I post a lot of photographs on my Instagrams, and I get so much attention from the Burmese diasporas who live overseas. And I think there was some missing gap from that isolation part. because photography was still used during the suppression, the isolation, but in a much more different way, not so freely like this. One of the main example is that a lot of photographic studio was driven out of business. Some, especially the Chinese operated one, was driven out of business. Ahuja also have to stop the business after, I think, in late 50, early 60, and also completely out of business after 1962. But the photography was used more on their use, but a lot of censorship, of course. And also with the isolation, there's also a lack of equipment. I've talked to some of my Myanmar friends, and they said back then, sometimes you need to smuggle the rolls of film from Thailand, and how to get it across without the military to checkpoint to see it. And then you have to send it out to get it developed somewhere. There was something, in that gap. So I think what my photograph speaks to them was something more nostalgic. And especially in Myanmar, when the weather is quite harsh, sometimes you don't find good photograph being well kept. Even some of the pieces that managed to collect, some of them are half torn, some of them are half insect bites, the termite dust, or even damaged by the moths. So I think it just, I think it helps to recollect the kind of memories that they have, or to make them kind of, I'll go back to my home and see what my grandmother's has, and try to reconnect with their past. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, or at least my book would help them to reconnect, especially when the future is still uncertain.
And how important are the negatives in your search?
I've come across some negative, especially I think at the beginning when the craft was carried out by professionals. That's where negative was rare to find, because somehow it was kept by the studios, and if we're lucky, it remains when the studio went out of business. But later on, when the film camera took over after Kodak developed the film camera after 1900, I think the more availability of the negative coming out from the amateur photographer. I was fortunate to come across a few, album that they keep the negative, but I haven't yet developed them. I managed to develop some, but sometimes the negative are in odd size, and it's not easy to find someone who can deal with that kind of, old negative anymore. Yes, but I do find them, and I hope one day I'll be able to manage to develop them. And then I think the negative that I found was very well annotated, with dates, with everything. So it's a good resource.
Yeah, personally, I found this, they're not easy to find. I had a small selection of early negatives for the Amekamba exhibition in 2018, and I just managed to trace a genealogy of negatives, because from glass to the plastic ones. But generally, to me, it's a completely different area of collecting, I'd say. I would like to consult my good friend, Mr. Philippe Damas here, who is also a very big collector based in Singapore, and perhaps you would have some ideas about negatives and how easy in your experience, finding.
Thank you. Well, I have seen quite a bit of negative on stereo, especially, one of my fields is in the China.
Which you collect?
Which you collect. Yeah, I do collect. I don't make a difference between negative and positive, if I can find negative. But in general, they tend to be sold cheaper than the positive for whatever reason. That's an interesting. It's a little bit like, I would compare that to someone in sculpture when you have plaster and bronze. And again, plaster, I'm as interested in plaster as I am in bronze, quite frankly. But they come at a very cheap price, even though they're the original essence of the art.
Yes.
So I compare the negative bit to yeah, to me it's the original. It's like a study for painting. That's also one that I would be collecting. But I always like the original idea. The good news that they tend to be cheaper than the finished products.
But you're lucky to find them. I could never find negatives.
Well, as I say, in stereo you find, I would say, about, I don't know, 30% of the stereo I see, they're negatives. But negative of picture is different. Celluloid, of course, there is a lot. That's more difficult to keep also.
Right.
They degrade, sometimes they take fires, you know.
Yes.
They can burn your collection.
I know.
Yeah, the famous archive in America caught fire, right? Because they're so combustible. The MGM archives or something in America, the whole archive burned down, right?
To add on from you, I think you show one photograph from linear stripes. I think some people did the research on him and said that he was probably, people regard him as the first commercial, not the first photographer that went into Burma and really take lots of photos. But may I remind you all that back then, it was so difficult. You need to carry cases of all the solutions, some equipments, and it's not an easy task as compared to now where I go with my phone and I can do anything, you know. And then I think Linnaeus tried when he used the wax paper as a mean of taking as a negative. But it turned out that all the wax melt, and then he had to do a lot of improvisation. And over the period of a few months that he was there, he took thousands of negative, but it turns out that only 1,000 or 2 that was usable. So I think that's part of the reason why when I see old prints, I treasure them so much because I know that it's not easy as an object to retain, to develop, and stand till time until now, knowing the process, and how much you have to improvise especially when the early day ethnographer, when they go out, they almost have to improvise everything. What if one case of my solution fell out from the mountains and I have nothing else to develop the film? They have to build the hut completely covered with the black cloth to make a dark room out of it. They have to used the kerosene container and make it into a basin. It's a lot of things,
Do you know of any daguerreotype that was taken in Burma?
I assume that there should be one, but so far none has surfaced yet. That's something that I've been discussing.
No, you know something about it.
Well, we assume because at that time when daguerreotype was fully widespread in the West, there was already some photographer that came to Maomeng in Myanmar at that time. And it's very likely that, I think back then, although it still takes a month to travel from Europe, but I think the photography traveled to Myanmar quite, fast comparing, time-wise. So I suspect that there has to be one, but we haven't found one yet. So I still need to prove this. But I think there should be.
Well, it's interesting because in Thailand, it did exist. They have famous monk.
But the daguerreotype one that was taken in Thailand by King Mongkut, the surviving one was the one that he sent to United States, also to France. Yes, or even in England, there's still one there. But the problem with daguerreotype is you take one photo, then it's the only copy from that shot. You don't produce any negative so that you can reproduce it again. It's only one item. So that's why I think that's the widespread of it is very limited.
I'm just wondering, what is the status of this community in Burma of the time? Is there any backstory to that particular photograph? Thank you.
There's some discussion about that particular photograph on Facebook a while ago. I will try to see if I can get information from you to validate if that person is actually a kind of, LGBT of the early days or something. But I think homosexuality or transgender, cross-dressing has existed in any cultures for a long time. And in Southeast Asia particularly, these people find their way to exist in the society especially in Myanmar, they thrive in the community of the spirit medium, where they have to cross-dress in order to perform certain rituals. And it's also a very widespread belief in the Thai-speaking people where the spirits, where the medium of the spirits, they have to cross-dress. It has to be the threshold between somewhere in between gender and everything in order for the spirits to come. So in Myanmar now, particularly, a lot of the gender community find their refuge in the kind of medium, spirits, medium dancing community or the makeup artists. But I'm sure in India, a lot of them end up being like the kind of, the money lender, and they have to, or even go after, the chak loans or something. But now it's improving. You see a lot of, LGBT activities now in Myanmar, so it's much more open now.
Thank you, Ek, and please join me to thank both Ek and Peter for this wonderful sharing on photography in Myanmar. And very importantly, so Ek has very kindly agreed to sign, right, his book. So please do purchase his books if you're interested. And I'm sure Ek will be very happy to sign as well. So both Peter and Ek also, I suppose, will be around. So if you have any questions that you did not get to ask earlier, please go ahead and ask them later. All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone.